Alrighty, everybody, you wanted it, you asked for it, I'm giving it to you. Nobody asked for this, I just thought of it entirely myself. So, Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator. You're all probably wondering, what on earth is that? Well, let me tell you something. So, the novel itself, I've got to be honest, was a big old mess, so I'm just going to summarise it for you. It takes place seconds after the original book ends. Wonka's taken the family to the chocolate factory, but the oldies are not having it. So that's, the four oldies in the bed, Grandpa George, Grandpa Georgine, and blah, 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 blah.
Fat.
There's a mad scramble inside the elevator and they're blasted into orbit. Meanwhile, the Space Hotel USA is on its maiden voyage, and of course they end up boarding it. The world watches as they discover it's infected by these aliens called vermicious canids, who are these weird, loopy aliens. The aliens attack the hotel, they attack the elevator, they attack the transport shuttle, which is carrying all the hotel staff and astronauts. There's a big battle in space, but Wonka brings the elevator back to the factory. And then, gear shift, we forget all about that crap, and the plot abandons all that. No more space hotel, no more aliens, because Wonka wants the old people to work in the factory. That's right, the second he is back, he's already talked about slavery. So he gives them this thing called Wonkavite, which makes them younger. But Grandpa Josephine takes too much and goes into a place called Minus Land. So Wonka and Charlie go to Minus Land to save her. There's talk about these other creatures called ghoulies, but we never actually see them, and they get back to the top. The old people are all restored to their original ages, and they're invited to the White House for tea. The end. You can probably gather, I'm not really a fan of the original. It had a lot of potential, but they spent so much blooming time in the White House with the president, and presumably all this was to set up the threequel, Charlie in the White House, which obviously we never got. There is a lot of padding in this book. Now, don't get me wrong, that's going to happen when every scene is dealing with at least 8 characters, that every conversation has this back and forth, and the characters discuss every conceivable option before something actually happens. Once we're actually back in the factory, the Oompa Loompas sing a lot. A lot. One of their songs literally goes on for 4 pages. Also, the book is unashamedly racist. I won't read any of the passages here, but the president has this whole bit where he sort of goes through the different world leaders. When he gets to the Chinese president, he literally says, "It's very difficult to phone people in China, Mr. President. The country is so full of wings and wongs. Every time you ring, you get a wong number." As usual, house rules. I have to use the original settings, locations and characters for the piece. I can't really expand on it an awful lot, even though I always end up doing, but I've got to keep it within the rules of the world. For this particular one, I ain't going to be bringing in any other franchises or any other sort of Tim Burton cinematic universe, so calm your freaking horses. But here's a few ground rules I want to get up off top. So the book is split into these 2 parts, right? You've got the space portion and the factory/Minus portion. Neither have any connection to each other, and so you go from this big action scene in space to a bunch of old people in a bed squabbling.
Fat.
There's one mention to the last book in the whole thing, an offhand comment about Violet Beauregard, and Wonka does a lot of the "sorry, can't hear you" bit.
Open your mouth a little wider when you speak.
I like the idea that during this opening space battle, Wonka's definitely showing his weak spots, and that's interesting. So we're going to keep that, but then in the book, once we get back to the factory, he's just literally God again, literally making these de-aging, up-aging serums, so we're going to tweak that. My pitch is going to switch things around a lot. But remember, this is a Tim Burton movie. This is a sequel to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory 2005. Oh, and it's a Christmas movie as well. Don't even worry about it. This is Let It Snow after all. Now, I'll admit, when we get into the pitch, I might not cover too many sort of Christmassy bits just because I want to keep the pace going, but just imagine in the background of every scene there's there's a Christmas tree or there's some sparkling lights or what have you. Now, as the fanboys will point out, canonically, the first adventure in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory takes place specifically on February 1st. So how is this story going to work if it takes place literally the end of that day? Don't even worry about it. You know why? Because we're getting the band back together. We're talking weird Michael Jackson, Donny Depp. We're talking Freddie Highmore, but as he is now. Flashbacks to daddy issues. Oh, you are not prepared for these flashbacks, let me tell you that much. And I'm also going with the idea that Tim Burton is holding all these actors at gunpoint to come back. It's as if this film was made in 2020 or 2021. Don't even worry about it. So everyone's at least 15 years older, but they're all still wearing the makeup and stuff that they would have been back then. It's funny. Now, final point on casting, as the oldies have a much bigger role in this. We're going to need to recast him. Kind of like a Dumbledore Gandalf situation. It's not necessarily that you need a younger actor, you just need one who can handle all the beats and who can handle actually, jumping around. So I'm really open as to who you can suggest, but Grandma Josephine has the sort of second biggest role out of the oldies, unless you count Grandpa Joe. So I think Jennifer Saunders could probably do a good one. And then as for Grandpa Joe's, we're going John Cleese. He's pretty funny, he's pretty grumpy. There you go. So how you Okay, so we open with the family floating around in the elevator, which has undergone a redesign. It's now split on 2 levels, the upper floor, where all the buttons and stuff are, and the lower level, where we have the front door and the old people's bed. So we do a funny bit where the narrator sort of like pings to each character, you know, like that meme that goes like, yep, that's me.
Yep, that's me.
Wonka's trying to concentrate, but the cracks are showing. It's been a few years since we saw him, but for him, this is just coming off the biggest PR disaster his company has ever faced. Also, he's used to working with children, not old people. There's a mad scramble and somehow the big button gets pushed, shoving them into orbit. They float around in chaos for a bit longer, and the narrator explains that during all of this, the maiden voyage of the Space Hotel USA was taking place. He explains that this had been in the works for months leading up to today, but the buckets didn't know this was happening because they couldn't afford to read the news. The hotel is this big capsule-shaped thing, very Grand Budapest, but it's completely empty. As a safety precaution, no souls were on board during its takeoff, but now it's safely in orbit, the transport capsule has been sent up carrying all the staff. Pan down on the state-of-the-art shuttle filled with hotel staff who are all cramped in with pots and pans. The capsule is manned by 3 very handsome astronauts, Shuckworth, Shanks and Showler, and was designed by the very talented Mr. Musk. He can literally be Elon Musk, or he could also be like Elon Musk stand-in, but for the purposes of this pitch, I wasn't creative enough to think of another name, so I'm just going to refer to him as Mr. Musk. But you see, he's the Willy Wonka of space travel. He's designed, like most of the hotel, he's designed this capsule boom. The astronauts see the great glass elevator and they freak out. Cut to the White House, where President Gilgrass is sat with a bunch of officials, mouths agape. Side note, look, I ain't getting political, kids. The president can be whoever you want. It can be a Trump narrative, it can be a Biden narrative, it could be an Obama narrative or a Clinton narrative. Do you know what I mean? I'm really not too fussed, it doesn't really matter. The elevator drifts in front of the regular news cameras, and the houses across the world come to a halt when they see this great glass elevator. Inside the elevator, there's excited chatter about being able to see the biggest event in space history up close. Well, Grandma Georgina isn't too impressed. She says, I'd have thought you'd have thought of this yourself, since you've got so many good ideas, Mr. Wonka. Wonka argues that space never interested him that much, but they challenge him with, well, Mr. Musk likes doing space stuff. Wonka says, alright then, watch this, and he docks with the hotel just to prove him wrong. So they dock and roll the bed inside, but the White House freaks out. President shouts at Mr. Musk for not predicting the eventuality of space pirates, but Mr. Musk is curious, he wants to see more. They get visuals on the hotel lobby and he susses him out. He says, that's Willy Wonka, my arch nemesis. So the family ooh and ah at the hotel for a few seconds, but these blob-like aliens appear in all the lifts around them. There's this weird kind of silent standoff, the aliens spell out the word scram, and the gang run back inside the elevator to take off. Charlie's got full of questions and says, what are they? And I'm gonna do my best Wonka impression here. Oh, you mean you didn't know? Well, it's a good thing you didn't. If you'd had the faintest idea of what horrors you were up against, the marrow would have run right out of your bones. You'd have been fossilised with fear and glued to the ground. Then they'd have got you. You'd have been a cookie's cucumber. You'd have been rasped into 1,000 tiny bits, grated like cheese and flocculated alive. They'd have made necklaces from your knuckle bones and bracelets from your teeth. Because those creatures, my dear ignorant boy, are the most brutal, vindictive, venomous, murderous beasts in the entire universe. Vermicious canids. Yeah. Let's boogie. Wonka explains that there's probably a family in every room in the hotel, thousands of them. The family ask why the canids didn't just eat them outright, and instead spell out a weird word. Wonka says it's because they like showing off. Anyway, this one canid, let's call him the leader, he's as big as a lorry, and he tails the elevator and fires back at them with his behind. Back in the Oval Office, the president wants to call the transporter back in, but Mr. Musk explains it's too late now. They watch in horror as the transporter docks with the hotel. The astronauts disembark and are eaten alive by the canids. Up in space, Charlie pleads with Wonka to save these people. He begs with Wonka, haven't you ever had a time when someone has helped you out of a tight spot? Wonka takes us into our first flashback, where he's a teenager. Do you remember he's still got that weird sort of tooth apparatus on his face? He's cold, he's alone on the street, he's just living off candy. And a nice stranger offers him some more. Gene Wilder's Willy Wonka. He says, I've been watching you, Willy, and I like what I see. He says, come to my college, the Royal College of Chocolatiers. There you'll learn the craft of candy and get to eat everything. Wonka says everything? Wonka says everything. And Willy Wonka accepts. Back in the elevator, Wonka learns this lesson and begrudgingly agrees to help. Don't worry guys, we're nearly at the factory, don't worry about it. They swoop in, dock the transporter, and the canids put up a good fight in the action set piece, but Wonka tows the transporter back down to Earth. The canids look like they're burning up on re-entry, but actually the fire is fueling them. Wait, they feed on fire? It makes sense. The canids split off all across the planet and land ready to wreak havoc. Charlie begs Wonka, "We have to do something." And Wonka says, "Correct, let's get back to my factory." But Grandpa Joe corrects him, "You mean Charlie's factory?" Wonka says, "Ah yes, of course, forgive me." And we're back in the factory. Big nostalgia hit. The family disembark and Charlie remarks that it's like seeing it for the first time again. Wonka says yeah, and another flashback. He sees the Candy College for the first time. It's the factory from the 1970s Willy Wonka movie. It's the old chocolate room, it's a little boat, it's the creepy Oompa Loompas, and he works hard against Slugworth and Goober to be the best. Gene Wilder takes notice. Anyway, there's a knock on the factory doors, followed swiftly by a boom. Tank wheels in, and out popped Gillygrass and Mr. Musk. Gillygrass explains that Wonka has brought Armageddon to Earth with these aliens, and it's his job to fix it. Wonka cockily explains, "No problem. Why, I've got a whole army of Oompa Loompas just waiting to do some good." He turns, does the weird noise thing,
Fat.
but they don't come. Well, this is awkward. He shouts again, but the Oompa Loompas appear in tribal war gear with candy weapons, and they're chanting this horrible, creepy rhythm. President says, "Wonderful, looks like your army's ready to fight." But Wonka corrects him. "Ready to fight us, sir." Wonka admits he might have neglected his caring responsibilities. He's got a lot of issues. Now, optional tweak to my own story here. We can have it that Mr. and Mrs. Bucket were left to look after the factory while the rest of the family went on this adventure. We're and Charlie take the oldies, but not the parents. I don't know. But A, it would mean less family members in the elevator and less sort of lines of dialogue to write, and less obviously screen time for actors. But B, it would mean that when they arrive at the factory, Mr. and Mrs. Bucket can be full of apologies and say that they've tried their best, but they're used to raising old people and children, not Oompa Loompas, and it would explain that why there's been that neglect. But honestly, I think in this Burton Depp world, I think it makes sense for Wonka to have literally just forgotten to feed the Oompa Loompas. So the Oompa Loompas launch an attack on the group, and the group run for cover. They're running the bed along the factory. And we can run through some fun scenes of the Oompa Loompas turning the factory against the group, but Wonka knows the one place even Oompa Loompas fear to tread. The experiment room. Of course, Mr. Musk has many sassy comments to make about how this isn't real science, and the president makes the argument that half the stuff in here could be used for terrorism. Wonka isn't interested in all of that, however. Wonka explains to the oldies that they can't keep running this bed around, and he's got no choice but to make the old ones younger so they can fight. The oldies protest, but Wonka explains that he's got just the thing. He explains he was experimenting on an old Oompa Loompas. Maybe that's why they're revolting from all the years of experimenting, and he came up with this. He reveals this pill, Wonkavite, the most valuable pills in the world. One pill takes 20 years off a human life. Charlie asks why he didn't take it himself if he was worried about getting older, but Wonka does the mumbling bit and sets the pills down. The oldies look at each other, and Wonka turns away. He knows what is about to happen. The oldies squabble amongst each other about who gets the most, and Wonka drifts into a flashback. Wonka is invited by Wilder to view his latest experiment yet, the tour. So now, a young Johnny Depp's Willy Wonka is watching from the shadows as the original Charlie and the Chocolate Factory takes place. We'll have a fantastic montage through the scenes set to like a Lana Del Rey version of Pure Imagination, and the narrator explains it was at this point Mr. Wonka began to see people for what they really are. Greedy, selfish, but most importantly, expendable. When he comes back up, Grandpa Georgina has disappeared, Grandma Josephine is a baby, and Grandpa George is a toddler. He deduces three things. Josephine was 80 and 3 months, so now she's 3 months old. Grandpa George was 81, so now he's 1 year old. And as Georgina was 78, and she took enough pills for 80 years, she's -2. Wonka and Charlie leave Grandpa Joe and Mr. Bucket feeding the babies with Wonka's Squidgemellow baby food. Wonka says they have to hurry because all minuses get subtracted. In the elevator, he cracks open a very discreet hatch with an ivory button, labelled Minus Land. They strap in and we'll do some crazy sequence all the way down. Wonka explains that down here there's things even he doesn't know about. It's a big factory after all. Anyway, down below, Wonka explains that all these Oompa Loompas that were experimented on will still be down here. He didn't want to leave them behind, so we had to find a way to age people up, turn minuses into pluses. He said he searched the world for the oldest thing on the planet, and what lives longer than anything else? Charlie replies, a tree. Wonka says, exactly my boy, a tree. The bristlecone pine in Wheeler Park, Nevada. Currently there are some that are over 4,000 years old. He says, ask any dendrochronologist, and then turns to the audience and says, and do please Google that word when you get home. So Wonka presents Vitawonk, Charlie says Wonka isn't very creative with his names. Wonka says, okay, smarty pants, when this is all done, how's about you come up with an age-dividing and age-adding serum and call it Bucket Fight or something? Anyway, we're here. And yep, you guessed it, this is a Tim Burton movie, so Minus Land is a grey, eerie, abandoned theme park, an old fairground, and they have to wear special goggles and grey suits to go through it. Wonka warns Charlie of Newlies. Invisible, there could be some right here, right now. Charlie says, do they kill you? Wonka says, poppycock. First they subtract you, then they divide you. He says it takes them ages. It's long division, after all. As they walk through, things get existential. Charlie reckons this is what hell must be like. And that's directly from the book, by the way. But Wonka says, oh no, I've been to hell. It's nothing like this. Charlie asks if he's been here before. Wonka says, oh yes, many times. Many, many times. And he flashes back to the trials at the Candy College, where they had to venture into Minus Land alone. So if you thought the original Oompa Loompas were creepy, imagine them in this creepy abandoned theme park where they're all scampering around like little devils. You know, and it's a real Hunger Games situation as well. Wonka's sent in with the other chocolatiers, but he sees them one by one get picked off, just like the maze scene in Goblet of Fire, and he emerges victorious. And Gene Wilder's Wonka says, okay, you're ready. You're ready to run your own factory. So his flashback is broken by Charlie saying, Mr. Wonka, I think she's there. And there's a faint outline of Grandpa Georgina laying horizontally. Charlie asks why she's laid like that. Wonka does a horizontal line in the air, because that's what a minus looks like. He says, anyway, Charlie, I got just one question for you. Who are you gonna call? And he whips out a proton pack. He sprays her with Vita Wonka and she disappears. Charlie reckons he must have sprayed her with at least 3 pints worth. He says 3 gallons, my boy. Charlie says, but won't that make her too old? Wonka stops. Yeah, kinda. Back up top, Grandpa Georgina, she's this really old soul at the edge of the bed, proper Coco situation. The years have caught up with her, and Charlie eggs Wonka on. Come on then, give her some Wonkavite. But Wonka argues he'd have to do it in one dose, and at her age, I don't think she could take it, my boy. I think she's too old. She's over 300. I'm sorry. Charlie collapses onto her, holds her tight and gives her a fantastic, heartfelt monologue about time and age. The buckets are ready to deck Wonka, but he argues that she did this to herself. Then she asks for Mr. Wonka by name. She pulls him in close, and she snatches the pills from his jacket. Wonka reaches for her, but she shouts, come on, boys! And the Oompa Loompas carry her out of bed. Wonka orders them to stop, but she shouts, too late! We made a deal while you were down there! And she downs the pills, getting younger and younger. She's still old, but manages to run for herself until she's back to the right age. She turns around and asks about the babies. Wonka gets out his proton pack. He's ready to blast the baby square in the face. He says, well, nothing else for it. And the screams of protest, and he stood there with the proton pack, and he flashes back to the final moment where Wonka stands up to Wilder. Wilder's gone too far this time. Wonka says he's going to leave to start his own chocolate factory. It'll be better than this one. Bigger. Wonka has finally faced up to his surrogate father figure and come out stronger. Back in the present, Charlie quietly lowers the proton pack and says, how's about we empty the ammunition and feed it to him with spoons? Wonka says, yeah, sure. Good thing. I wouldn't have thought of that. I can see the factory will be in good hands with you, Charlie. So they spoon feed the babies, the oldies grow back to the normal age, and Wonka tells everybody to suit up. This is Armageddon, after all. They arm themselves with candy-themed weapons and armour, and the Oompa Loompas agree to help them, if Wonka faces penance afterwards for abandoning them. Side by side with Mr. Musk, the President and Charlie, Wonka agrees that there will be dark days ahead. But for now, let's boogie! Which sets us up for the third film in the franchise where they fight aliens. And again, because this is Tim Burton, now we're going to see a real Mars attack situation where the Vermicious Canids evolve, and, you know, they have little Canid families and little Canid children, and maybe in Earth's atmosphere they evolve too much and they start becoming more human-like, and they have a real existential crisis as to what do they do. And just throwing titles around, so we've got Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator, Charlie and the End of the World, that I think that will turn some heads. Charlie and Willy Wonka in the end, or Willy Wonka in the End of the World. I don't know, either one could work, don't even worry about it.
Fat